Okay. Should it be streaming? Let's check this. Is it connected to YouTube? Anyways, it should be. Hey everyone, it's your friend Mr. Wolf, and today I'm doing a YouTube live stream. Now, I haven't done this before, so I don't know what to expect for YouTube. But in today's stream, my first YouTube stream, we are going to be reacting to Johnny to Chello's Futurama retrospective, and he has 3 retrospectives: Fox retrospective, the movie retrospective, and of course we have the Comedy Central retrospective. If you didn't know, Futurama first aired on Fox and it went to movies, and then it started airing on Comedy Central, if any of you didn't know that. So today we're going to be reacting to these 3 videos, because I just love Futurama, and maybe, and then maybe, just maybe, we might have time for Pet Simulator X. So without any further ado, let's begin. Stupid ads.
Drama. Last month I did a little retrospective on the straight-to-DVD movie era of Futurama, and I had a ton of fun reflecting on what I liked and didn't like about that little middle section of Futurama's lifespan. So I figured we might as well make this a trilogy and cover the Fox and Comedy Central eras in separate retrospectives. But we're gonna do this Star Wars style and go with the prequels next, so join me as I go
back in time.
all the way back to the mid-90s, when they conceived of and began to write Futurama. That's right, we're going to cover the golden era of Futurama, the Fox seasons, the Robo-Creme de la Robo-Creme, the standard definition tearjerkers, the funny but also thinky sci-fi fun-stravaganza. Futurama's first 72 episodes on Fox gets its own retrospective, starting right after I talk about today's sponsor, Surfshark. Adult animation juggernaut.
It's impossible to talk about Futurama without first talking about the adult animation juggernaut, The Simpsons.
I have to do a lot of reading for my job, emails, reports.
Both created by cartoonist Matt Groening. After The Simpsons' instantaneous and monumental success, Fox wanted another one, and why wouldn't they? So around 1996, Groening enlisted Simpsons writer and sci-fi fanatic David X. Cohen to help develop a new comedic science fiction series for Fox. What came out of that was Futurama, after a long and painful development and pitching process. But eventually, Fox picked up the series for a 13-episode inaugural season. When I say that Futurama had a tumultuous history, that would be a major understatement. From the get-go, Fox had concerns over the premise and wanted more creative control than they had over The Simpsons, a notion that Groening outright rejected. Groening seemed very confident in their vision for the show.
So with The Simpsons, that was my take on the American family. So what I've done to the American family with The Simpsons, we're going to do to science fiction with Futurama.
In spite of the struggles to get the show up and running, they managed to put together an incredible writer's room and voice cast. The writer's room consisted of many Simpsons alum as well as newcomers, but most notable was the sheer amount of cumulative education the staff had. There were 3 PhDs and 7 master's degrees in the writing staff alone, which shined through in a lot of its science-focused humor.
And the winner is number 3 in a quantum finish.
No fair! You change the outcome by measuring it.
But the cast was really something special, gathering some of the most talented voice performers in the business. Billy West played an avalanche of characters, including Fry, Zoidberg, and the Professor. Katie Sagal was perfect as Taranga Leela. John DiMaggio literally stole the show as Bender. And then rounding out the cast were Phil LaMarr, Lauren Tom, Maurice LaMarche, and Tress MacNeille. Truly one of the most legendary voice casts that has ever existed. And that cast almost included the incomparable Phil Hartman, who sadly passed before he could fill the role of Zap Brannigan. So with such a top-notch writing staff and voice cast, why did the show have so much trouble with the network and with audiences? Well, there are a few reasons for this. Futurama was basically The Simpsons' younger sibling, and being the follow-up to arguably the most popular show of all time is a lot to live up to. The audience already goes in with a certain type of expectation, and I think for a lot of people, these expectations weren't immediately met, or the true nature of the show wasn't immediately understood. But Fox didn't really help in this matter either. They opted to shuffle Futurama's scheduled airtime multiple times over its run on the network. The show was persistently pulled from the schedule due to sporting events that ran long, and their erratic release ultimately led to the 4 produced seasons of Futurama being spread out over 5 broadcast seasons instead. But in spite of these obstacles, Futurama managed to accumulate a very dedicated audience over its time on Fox, though its saving grace would ultimately be Adult Swim, who started syndicating the series alongside Family Guy. This consistent time slot grew the show's audience exponentially and in the end saved the series. But let's back it up again and talk about the actual content of seasons 1 through 4, because that's really what I'm here to do. The production and history of the show is totally fascinating stuff, but the thing we're all interested in is the show itself. So I'm going to talk about the show in the format and order that it was intended to be watched in. Though the show ended up shuffling the order and releasing 5 broadcast seasons, which you might be familiar with if you watch the show on Hulu, I'm going to be talking about each of the first 4 production seasons as they were produced. So let's start with where it all began, December 31st, 1999. Or actually, March 28th, 1999. That's when the episode aired. Space Pilot 3000 will go down in history as one of the greatest pilots of all time. The episode so expertly sets up our main characters, the premise of the series, and the setting with an efficiency rarely seen in TV. Just from the cold open alone, we're introduced to Philip J. Fry, understand his place in the world, see the inciting incident for the entire series, and are introduced to the overall premise. It's so incredibly well written.
Parents, my coworkers, my girlfriend. I'll never see any of them again. Yahoo!
This pilot should be studied ad nauseum by up-and-coming writers, but even after the cold open, the episode introduces us to both Taranga Leela and Bender Bending Rodriguez, establishing their own fears and insecurities naturally and effectively.
You Chip. What are you doing?
Quitting.
Why?
Because I've always wanted to.
Wait, you're the only friend I have.
You really want a robot for a friend?
One of my favorite shots in the entire series is this introductory shot of New York as Fry ventures out into his new surroundings for the first time. It so perfectly establishes this weird retro future that Futurama would become known for. Hover cars, weird billboards, giant pneumatic tubes. All of these things add to the charm of the world that they were building. It never feels like an unrecognizable world of future tech. It's all vaguely familiar with a futuristic twist. And this was intentional. The point was that though this series took place in the future, they needed the audience to still find it relatable. It was taking modern problems and reflecting them through a futuristic mirror. So like I said, this pilot is one of the all-time greats, beautifully establishing characters, setting, and premise in a hilarious and efficient package. And also a glimpse of the heart the show would become known for.
My parents abandoned me here as a baby, and I don't even know what galaxy they were from. I know how it feels to be alone.
And the continued introduction of the world of tomorrow was paced perfectly. The second episode the series has landed introduces us to our secondary characters, Amy, Hermes, and Zoidberg, and also brings the crew off-world for the very first time, albeit not very far, just the moon, but the slow reveal of how big the Futurama universe could be was welcomed, because there was simply so much to establish in the expansive landscape of the series. And while the second episode is absolutely hilarious, it reaffirms that the show is going to have an emotional core that tugged at the heartstrings. This episode was so smart because it tried to show us this new and exciting future through Fry's eyes.
The moon was like this awesome, romantic, mysterious thing, hanging up there in the sky where you could never reach it, no matter how much you wanted to.
God, I just really love that scene. And the first season is immaculately paced. The third episode, I Roommate, firmly establishes Fry's friendship with Bender, as well as gives him a place to live, something that we needed to know as he was thrust into the future. Love's Labor's Lost in Space introduces Zap Brannigan and establishes a lot of Leela's long-standing character traits and long-standing regrets. It also brings in Nibbler, who would play a big role later. They just did a great job introducing us to what the show had to offer, offer without wasting any real time, and slowly began to move the crew further and further away from Earth, landing on alien worlds in Love's Labor's Lost in Space, Fear of a Bot Planet, and My Three Sons. But they also weren't afraid to do hilarious, grounded stories simply set in New York. A Fishful of Dollars shows Fry become a billionaire thanks to the interest in his bank account over 1,000 years, and though they obviously needed to re-establish the status quo and make him lose all of his money, it was a really funny and interesting character study. Plus, it introduced us to the longtime antagonist of the series, Mom. They also made an effort, even this early on, to have pro-environmental messages in the show. A Big Piece of Garbage is probably my favorite episode of the first season, and it introduces a hilarious sci-fi concept in the midst of an anti-pollution driven plotline. They actually kind of laid it on thick too, it's pretty funny.
Were it not for your 20th century garbage making skills, we'd all be buried under 20th century garbage.
Now, not every season 1 episode was a banger. A Flight to Remember was ironically maybe not all that memorable. Mars University had some funny stuff in it, but didn't leave a huge impact on me personally. But we also got episodes like Hell is Other Robots, which to this day is considered one of the best the show has to offer, introducing the incredible side character, the Robot Devil, who would go on to play major parts in important episodes of the series. He was also played by the legend Dan Castellaneta, aka Homer Simpson. And can we talk about the song?
Here on level 1 of Robot Hell.
The season even rounded out with one of their most beloved parodies, Fry and the Slurm Factory, a play on Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And while I prefer the more original stories in Futurama to the straight up parodies, it's hard not to love this episode.
Runka-lunka dunkety darn guards. Shut the hell up!
All in all, Futurama started off strong. The animation itself was a bit looser than you'd come to expect later, but much less so than first seasons of shows like The Simpsons, Family Guy, or King of the Hill. It also would establish our characters and our world building in incredibly effective ways, and it tugged at the heartstrings through that emotional core that I continued to mention. But things would really only get better from there because season 2 continued to grow the series in hilarious and memorable ways.
Hey, you know what's better than a $5,000 PC? What? A $5,000 PC that costs $0. It's time to...
Though I think that season 2 maybe dials back on the emotional core a tad bit after getting so many great moments in season 1, it absolutely dials up the comedy and sci-fi in really funny ways. The first episode of the season, I Second That Emotion, introduces us to the mutants who live under New York, and even throws a little Easter egg in the mix for long-running mystery in the series. They pretty immediately expand on characters like Zap Brannigan and Brannigan Begin Again, and firmly establish him as a comedic powerhouse.
What makes a man turn neutral? Lust for gold? Power? Or were you just born with a heart full of neutrality?
And of course, they introduced the character who would maintain his position as president of Earth throughout the remainder of the series, Richard Nixon. Overall, season 2 does a ton right. Episodes that put a focus on secondary characters like Brannigan Begin Again, Why Must I Be a Crustacean in Love, and how Hermes requisitioned his groove back showed that the series didn't need to just rely on its primary characters for effective storytelling. Interestingly, season 2 doesn't overly rely on pure sci-fi either, opting to take a lot of fun sitcom ideas, concepts, and themes, and rolling in a sci-fi twist. Xmas Story takes the Christmas episode concept and adds in a murderous, rampaging robot Santa who has been programmed to judge everyone as naughty. Put Your Head on My Shoulders throws Fry and Amy into a surprise relationship. The typical sitcom idea here would generally be that when they break up, they have to deal with working in close quarters at Planet Express, but instead Futurama dials that up a notch and has Fry's disembodied head temporarily attached to Amy, making their breakup that much more difficult. Why Must I Be a Crustacean in Love has Fry attempt to coach Zoidberg in his dating life, with the added caveat that Zoidberg's alien species has a drastically different form of procreation. It's a really fun formula that they would continue to use effectively through to the end of the series. Season 2 also started to dig a bit more into some long-running mysteries and storylines. While there was a nice moment in season 1's A Flight to Remember, Xmas Story was probably the first big step in the Fry and Leela romance that would run through to the finale of the show. What I love about this episode is that it firmly establishes Fry and Leela's connection outside of romance. It's initially a purely platonic bond formed through their mutual loneliness. While Fry lamented the fact that he left all of his friends and family back in the year 2000, Leela similarly lamented her lifetime as an orphan who never knew her parents.
Here I am whining like a pig, while all along Leela was as lonely as a frog.
And yeah, the episode does have them almost kiss when they were faced with what they believed to be imminent death, but the moment that I think meant the most to their development was this one.
Leela! Oh my god, you saved my life. I am gonna get you so many lizards.
Nah, just kidding. Actually, this one.
It's okay. You're lonely and I'm lonely, but together, we're lonely together.
The show really established itself as being willing to slow down and embrace these smaller, grounded and emotional character moments, and I think that's what made it both stand out and allowed it to stand the test of time, especially given that a lot of these character arcs would be serialized throughout the run, something you didn't really see from network animated sitcoms back in the day. Speaking of serialized character arcs, they also really started to dig into the mystery of Leela's origins in this season too. Besides the moment in Xmas story that focused on her loneliness, there was also the aforementioned mutant hint in episode 201, but most prominently was the episode A Bicyclops Built for Two, in which Leela believes that she has found the only other remaining member of her species.
We are the last remaining Cyclopses. Our planet is Cyclopia. This is the capital, Cyclops City. Stop me if I'm going too fast for you.
It's a really great episode that shows how important Leela's desire to find a sense of belonging in her origins and history is to her, because though she meets this other Cyclops and has an opportunity to save her species, she also quickly learns that he's an asshole and that she doesn't like him. It's a tough scenario where Leela's head and heart are at odds with one another. In the end, it turns out that the other Cyclops, Alcazar, was a con man and not a Cyclops at all, so they didn't go through with the marriage, but the episode went a long way to show how important finding where she came from is to Leela. And I would be hard-pressed not to talk about the problem with poplars, probably one of the most popular episodes of Futurama. Honestly, before Futurama became one of my favorite series, this was the episode that always came to mind when I thought about the show. It's just a straight-up good time.
Pop a poplar in your mouth when you come to Fishy Joe's. What they're made of is a mystery. Where they come from, no one knows.
The episode combines a really fun and unique premise with a great sci-fi twist when they realize that the food they've been collecting and selling is actually the offspring of an alien species. The episode also establishes what would be a long-running bit, the Waterfall family, as Free Waterfall Jr. fights for animal rights.
We're with mankind for ethical animal treatment.
And of course gets eaten by Lur of the planet Omicron Persei 8.
This is not happening.
Though I think my absolute favorite sequence in all of Season 2 has to be the finale musical number in How Hermes Requisitioned His Groove Back. Just an incredibly fun song with so many memorable lines, but also really well directed and animated. So like I said, while Season 2 maybe dialed back a tad on the emotional core of the series, it didn't abandon it entirely, and it also just continued to cement the show as a smart comedic juggernaut, all while establishing some of the most beloved and memorable through lines that the series had to offer. It was an excellent sophomore effort that would pave the way for what is, in my opinion, the strongest run of the show, with Season 3. Futurama's third production season, right off the bat, hit us with what many consider to be one of the strongest episodes of the series, Amazon Women in the Mood. While I'm not quite as high on this episode as many others, I do think it's hard to deny that it's very funny. A great follow-up to a couple of ongoing stories, Leela's repulsion for Zap Brannigan, and of course, Kif and Amy's budding romance. This one pretty immediately hit the show with some incredible humor.
She's built like a steakhouse, but she handles like a bistro.
And while I find that the differences between men and women humor that it overly relies on didn't quite age as well as a lot of the other humor in the show, there are some really great moments. But the second episode the season has to offer, Parasites Lost, is in my opinion one of the absolute finest the show has ever produced. I can't express how much I love this episode. When Fry gets parasitic worms that basically put push his body and mind to operate at peak efficiency, the crew does their own fantastic voyage to try and eliminate the worms from his system.
Where are we, the ass?
But Fry's newfound mental clarity also helps Leela see his potential, and Fry confesses his love.
Leela, I love you.
This is a plot point that would continue to be important through the entire series, that Fry and Leela have an undeniable connection and bond, but Fry's immaturity poses issues with his viability as boyfriend material. And though their romance in Parasites Lost goes incredibly well, including one of the most beautiful sequences in the series when Fry plays the holophoner for Leela, Fry worries that Leela only loves him for what the worms have made him. Fry wants to get there on his own.
Oh, Fry, I love what you've become.
What I've become.
Fry eliminating the worms from his own system is bold and heartbreaking, and also just such a fun science fiction idea.
He's bluffing! No creature would willingly make an idiot out of itself!
Obviously, you've never been in love!
I can't express enough how much I love this episode. But we've got to move on because literally 2 episodes later is one of the absolute greatest episodes of television history, honestly. And what was for a long time my favorite episode of the entire run of Futurama, The Luck of the Fryrish. I cannot say enough about this episode. It's truly one of the most well-written pieces of television I've ever seen. Absolutely hilarious, but maintains an honest and emotional character through line with Fry's anger over his past with his brother, who he now believes stole his identity after he disappeared.
That Clover helped my rat-fink brother steal my dream of going into space. Now I'll never get there.
You went there this morning for donuts.
This was the first time the show really utilized flashbacks to Fry's past and its story structure, something they would do a few more times over the series. But the end of the episode is where it really delivers the strong emotional gut punch. Fry learns that his brother in fact did not steal his identity. He actually named his son after Fry.
I'm naming you Philip J. Fry in honor of my little brother, who I miss every day.
God, that just hurts every damn time to watch. What a good episode. And this was literally all within 4 episodes of the 3rd season. Not every episode of this run was a banger, but it absolutely has a collection of some of the best episodes the show has to offer. The Day the Earth Stood Stupid started to explore a long-standing mystery that David Cohen and co. had planned from the very beginning, the idea that Fry had been sent to the future because he had a role to play with universal implications. And this creates for a very fun episode with giant brains that make everyone except for Fry very dumb.
Ow! Fire hot!
The prophecy will help. Fire indeed hot.
We'll talk more about this as they follow it up, but it's another really strong episode in Season 3. The season is also filled with what I consider to be very underrated classics, like Insane in the Mainframe, when Fry and Bender are both sent to a robot insane asylum. This one introduces Roberto, who is truly one of the funniest side characters ever created.
Now stand back, I gotta practice my stabbing.
Bendin' in the Wind is another that I feel is very underrated, utilizing its guest voice musician Beck in hilarious ways that actually build on what we know about Bender as a character. It's really fun stuff.
With real words, not phony ones like odelay.
Odelay is a word. Just look it up in the dictionary.
And the season closes out with some of the show's best episodes. The final 9 episodes include 3 all-timers: Time Keeps on Slippin', Roswell That Ends Well, and Godfellas, as well as the very underrated Future Stock. Time Keeps on Slippin' is another that follows up the Fry and Leela romance arc in exciting and heartbreaking ways, all through another amazing sci-fi
Okay, I'm back. Didn't know I was muted that entire time, but whatever.
Premise in which time starts to skip ahead at random intervals, causing a mass confusion. It also establishes the Globetrotters as a hilarious group of side characters, and of course ends with one of the most heartbreaking moments of the series. During a time skip, Fry somehow wins over Leela, and the two get married, but because time skipped, neither of them remember how or why it happened, resulting in their immediate divorce. As the episode closes, Fry sees exactly what he did to win over Leela, moving the stars themselves to write her a love note, just before it's destroyed forever, with Leela never seeing the message. Big oof. Roswell That Ends Well is another of the most beloved and memorable episodes of the show as well, and it even won Futurama their very first Emmy Award. The episode attempts to explain the infamous Roswell, New Mexico UFO incident through the Planet Express crew's accidental time travel, which creates for some absolutely hilarious moments in the past, obviously an era that we had yet to see in the series.
Fellas, this visit's top secret. No one's to know about it, except the senior officers, scientists, and a single conspiracy not no one will believe.
But what makes this episode most memorable is the so-called nasty in the pasty, where we learned that Fry accidentally became his own grandfather.
Did you say something, dear?
This also ultimately explains why Fry was so important in saving the universe from the brain spawn. Being his own grandfather is why he has no delta brainwave, and why he can survive their dumbification. And then Godfellas is just a damn work of art, an episode I've loved for as long as I can remember. Bender is accidentally launched through space, and first he becomes a god, and then he meets a god. It's a beautiful and existential episode that builds on Bender's own insecurities as a character who craves validation through a desire to be loved and remembered, and ultimately, Bender being loved and remembered by his best friend Fry is what saved him from a cruel fate of eternal floating.
I wish I had Bender back.
The show is starting to get really ambitious, as the last 3 episodes I talked about really establish, and it continued to just knock these episodes out of the park, too. But that isn't to say that Season 3 was perfect either. It maybe ends a little underwhelmingly with the 30% Iron Chef, a decent episode, but not the most exciting finale. Even though it establishes a new character, Hermes' son Dwight, the Route of All Evil stands out to me as a pretty lackluster episode. And Where the Buggalo Roam is not only a pretty mediocre episode comedically, it's full of really frustrating and problematic Native American stereotypes that plays both offensive and lazy. It's definitely one of my least favorite episodes. But Season 3 was basically when Futurama hit its stride and really showcased its potential to the highest degree. It has probably 6 or 7 episodes that sit in my top 15 of the entire show, and it also just fully took hold of that emotional core that the show is known for, leaning hard into strong emotional character moments, all while never sacrificing the incredible comedy or sci-fi. And this is a trend that would continue into Futurama's final season of its original run on Fox. Though I think this final run doesn't quite hit with the same consistency of Season 3, it has some of the best episodes of the show. While the season maybe starts off a little weak overall, with the first 6 episodes of the season having 5 episodes that I think are average or below, there's Kif Gets Knocked Up a Notch, Love and Rocket, Less Than Hero, and A Taste of Freedom. All are fine episodes, but nothing to write home about. But it also gave us Leela's Homeworld, an episode that the entire series had been building up to. I actually did an entire video on this episode, but it's hard to overstate just how excellent Leela's Homeworld is. The episode finally reveals exactly where Leela came from, and though we had been led to believe the entire run that she was an alien abandoned on Earth as a child, it turns out that she is actually a mutated human, the least mutated mutant of all time, in fact, which led to her parents deciding to leave her in an orphanarium on the surface to give her a better life than she could hope to achieve in the sewers. It's an incredibly heartwarming episode and an absolutely masterful reveal, one of the best the show has ever had. The ending showcases a montage where we see that for her entire life, Leela's parents had actually been watching out for her, even though she didn't realize it, and it stands as one of the most emotionally affecting sequences in all of Futurama. I could go on for a while about this episode, but I already did that in the other video, so if you want to hear more about why this reveal was so effective, check that one out. And speaking of emotionally affecting, we've arrived at the most infamous episode of Futurama, Jurassic Bark. Yeah, it's the one with Fry's dog, so get your tissues ready. This was the second time the series utilized these flashbacks to Fry's past in the story structure, and once again it worked incredibly well. Fry discovers the fossilized remains of his dog in a museum exhibit, and then has an opportunity to bring him back from the dead with Farnsworth's help.
Know ye now what it feels like to be doggone!
Fry ultimately changes his mind when he learns that Seymour lived a long life, but oh boy, I know I don't have to remind you about this emotional gut punch.
I'll never forget him. But he forgot me a long, long time ago.
This obviously turned out to not be true, as we see at the end of the episode that Seymour actually waited the remainder of his life for Fry to return. No joke, it makes me tear up just writing those words in the script right now. It's one of the most painful moments I've ever seen in television, and I think a lot of people agree with me there. The episode is great for many other reasons too. It's very funny, but also has an important subplot focusing on Bender's insecurities once again, as he becomes jealous of Fry's excitement to reconnect with Seymour. But obviously it's remembered for that ending. I don't think there are any episodes of the show that had a more lasting impact on its fandom than Jurassic Park. The season would continue in its ambition, too. The Why of Fry follows up the brain spawn story as Fry has to stop the giant floating brains once and for all, but not before he learns the terrible truth that the writers had planned from the very beginning. Fry had actually been pushed into the freezer by Nibbler, who needed Fry to exist in the future so that he could stop the brain spawn. Fry basically learns that the most important event in his life was not actually just happenstance, but something that somebody did to him. It's pretty emotional.
You were the only one who could help us. What is one life weighed against the entire universe?
But it was my life.
Fry is actually given a chance to change the past, but opts not to, because of his friends and Leela specifically. It's a really, really nice moment, especially in what was looking like it would be the final season of Futurama. The entire back half of this final Fox season has some really strong stuff. Teenage Mutant Leela's Hurdles, Where No Fan Has Gone Before, and 300 Big Boys stand out as incredibly fun episodes that probably get overlooked. The Farnsworth Parabox is without a doubt one of the best the show has ever made, with not only an amazing sci-fi premise, but with some incredibly funny comedic moments.
1 year later, I gave Leela a diamond scrunchie, and we were married. 1 year later, I got beat up at a Neil Diamond concert by a guy named Scrunchy.
But the episode that I really want to talk about is The Sting, which I believe to be one of the greatest pieces of television that has ever graced our screens. It's truly something so unbelievably special. I know you've all watched the show before, so you know the twist, but the gist is that the episode all takes place in Leela's trippy coma dream, in which she thinks Fry has been killed, sacrificing himself to save her. It has some of my favorite sequences in animation history, and the entire episode has this sort of scary, dreamy vibe that we've never seen in any other episode of Futurama.
I love you.
I'm so scared, Fry. I don't know what to do.
Just wake up, Leela. Please, just wake up.
But the ultimate reveal, that it was all Leela's coma dream, is so ridiculously effective, and not just because it was a surprising twist, but because of the subtle details in the end of the episode that tie everything together so beautifully. Leela dreams that Fry gave her a gift, and that he put her jacket on her when she was cold, and that they were traveling together on a sleigh through these ice fields. The end of the episode shows that Fry had left a gift at her nightstand, that he had put his jacket around her while she was sleeping, and that the television was showcasing those very ice fields that they traveled through in the dream. Fry sat at Leela's side and spoke to her the entire time.
It got through, Fry. It got through.
It's just one of the most brilliantly conceived episodes of anything I've ever seen, and it all ties into our ongoing investment in Fry and Leela's connection. It's my favorite episode of Futurama, and I honestly can't say that enough times. But though this season does have some of Futurama's best efforts, it also has some low points. I mentioned before that the season starts a little slowly with a slew of average or forgettable episodes, but it also features probably the worst episode of the show, Bend Her, which is just fundamentally transphobic and a huge bummer. I was never a huge fan of this one outside of the introduction of Barbados Slim, but it's aged even worse than you can imagine, and I genuinely just skip over it when I rewatch the show. Honestly, as great as Futurama is, it definitely had its brushes with homophobic and transphobic humor, even in strong episodes. Obviously, this was the case for a lot of shows that aired in this era, but Futurama being such a strong and in a lot of other ways progressive show, it's a bummer to see. Obviously, that isn't to say the show can't be enjoyed in spite of these jokes, it's just important to acknowledge them. But with that, let's talk about the very first series finale the show ever had. And another of my absolute favorite episodes, probably in my top 3. The Devil's Hands Are Idle Playthings ended Futurama for the first time on the best imaginable note. This episode is not only so funny, but so emotionally impacting in a way that leaves you somehow paradoxically satisfied and desperate to see what comes next. It's an incredible episode of television and a really strong finale. Fry makes a deal with the robot devil and swaps hands with him so that he can play the holophoner well again, all in an attempt to win over Leela once and for all. With his new hands, Fry becomes an incredible musician and writes an entire opera about Leela and his love for her. It all culminates in the robot devil's own trickery. Through a deal with Bender, he causes Leela to become deaf, and then tricks Leela into trading him her hand in marriage so that she can hear Fry's opera for her. Fry then must choose between losing the woman he loves or losing the hands that made her fall in love with him in the first place. Just a masterfully written deal with the devil storyline. The end of the Fox era of Futurama is perfect. It's one of the best moments the series has to offer, as Fry sits down and plays one last song for Leela, even though he's lost his skills.
Please don't stop playing, Fry. I want to hear how it ends.
The series ends for the first time with Fry playing music for Leela, and a vision of himself and Leela kissing and walking off into the sunset together. And then, it was over. For a long time, this was the final piece of Futurama that ever existed. And though when I was younger, all I ever wanted was to see what happened next, I do think that if this had been the very end for Futurama, I would have ultimately been satisfied. It's such a good episode that gives us a glimpse at a possible future for our characters, all while celebrating the journey they've gone on. They absolutely stuck the landing with this episode. The Fox era of Futurama, in my opinion, is one of the greatest stretches of television writing that has ever existed. No, it isn't perfect. There are some lackluster episodes and even some dated and problematic stories that don't age well, but it's hard to deny what the show was able to accomplish in its 4 production seasons. Emerging from the shadow of The Simpsons to establish itself as its own special and unique type of animated sitcom, experimenting with types of storytelling that hadn't really been heard of in network sitcom format at the time, and really embracing an emotional, character-based type of storytelling that would keep fans coming back for more, even fighting through their own tears. It's hard to describe how much I love and appreciate this original run of Futurama. And while there are stories and episodes that I absolutely love from the remaining eras of the show, the DVD movies and the Comedy Central seasons, the Fox run will always be what Futurama is for me. There's just something special about these stories and these characters, and I think that this was felt in its fan base. Because though shows like The Simpsons might be bigger, it's hard to think of a more dedicated and invested fan base than Futurama. A fan base that stuck with them through multiple cancellations and revivals, rivals, and to this day will watch an idiot like me ramble about the show thousands of times. The golden era of Futurama was truly something special. Folks, thanks so much for tuning into another Futurama retrospective.
Personally, the Fox era was okay for me. It was definitely better than the DVDs, but personally, my favorite era was the Comedy Central era. That's my personal favorite. The Comedy Central era. That's my opinion. Now, let's head on to Futurama's Forgotten Era, a movie retrospective.
Still using a default browser that looks so boring? Switch to Opera GX, the first browser built for...
When people talk about the full run of Futurama, they tend to divide it into two categories: the original Fox seasons and the Comedy Central revival seasons. The first run and the second run, which is actually a fair assessment. Technically, production seasons 1 through 4 aired on Fox, while 5 through 7 aired on Comedy Central. However, production season 5 is sort of an outlier because, while it did eventually air on Comedy Central, initially it went straight to DVD in the form of 4 movies. This is why, personally, I see Futurama as existing in 3 different eras, because these straight-to-DVD movies absolutely feel like their own thing, and wedge themselves firmly in between the 2 broadcast runs of the show, bridging that gap. So today, let's dive into the seemingly forgotten era of Futurama and talk about Bender's Big Score, The Beast with a Billion Backs, Bender's Game, and Into the Wild Green Yonder. But first, let's talk about today's sponsor, Surfshark. Surfshark VPN is a super cool and helpful tool that can protect your information from data thieves and secure your online life. I have a ton on both my channel and my podcast, Cartoons That Curse, which, fun fact, is currently in the middle of covering.
Don't want to hear about this.
Bring these very Futurama movies, so make sure to go check those out on here on YouTube or any podcast platforms, if that floats your boat. But since this is a new video, I'll do a little abridged rundown of how the revival came to be. Futurama ended on Fox in 2003, but thanks to its syndication success on Adult Swim, as well as great DVD sales for the first 4 seasons, the show was granted a revival in the form of 4 straight-to-DVD movies, starting with Bender's Big Score in 2007. In one of the DVD commentaries for these movies, I can't remember exactly which one, David X. Cohen said that they had initially wanted to do only 2 movies, but pitched the studio 4 movies, expecting them to haggle down to the 2 that they actually wanted, but Fox ended up saying yes when they asked for 4. The way this season was written was actually quite a bit different than the series. A small team of writers assembled to brainstorm and break story ideas for the films, but eventually each screenplay was assigned to a different writer. Because of the longer production cycle and these movies not being part of an ongoing series, it doesn't appear that they benefited from having an ongoing writer's room for the duration of their production, a luxury of the original run. The season is really interesting to me. I actually have a ton of nostalgia for all 4 of these movies, and it's hard to describe how excited I was when they were announced, but they're definitely these outliers in the production because they were written and produced so differently than either the original run or revival seasons. Each movie was technically made up of 4 episodes apiece, and eventually each movie was trimmed down so that they could broadcast each movie as 4 separate episodes. So to anyone who saw them this way, this could just feel like a season with 4 serialized arcs rather than 4 movies. This is actually how they're currently listed on Hulu, each movie divided into 4 episodes each. I'm curious if any of you have only seen these movies in episodic form, so comment below if this was how you watched them for the first time, and how that affected your opinion of Season 5 overall. But also, there are extra jokes in the full movie version, so it might be worth going to watch those if you haven't seen them. The small writers' room gathered to brainstorm in 2005, and on November 27th, 2007, the first Futurama movie, Bender's Big Score, was released on DVD. And I gotta say, I will defend Bender's Big Score until the day I die. This movie stands as one of my favorite Futurama stories. It is seriously something special. In fact, I've talked about it a lot already in these videos and also this podcast episode, so if this video doesn't fully scratch that itch, feel free to check those out. Bender's Big Score did everything I hoped it would do. It brought back the series on a much grander scale, gave us emotional character-based storytelling, and an incredible time travel sci-fi plot with twists and turns aplenty. Honestly, I feel like I could have gone to see Bender's Big Score on the big screen and been completely satisfied with it as a cinematic experience. And that shouldn't be too big of a surprise. It was written by Ken Keeler, who has written some of the best episodes in all of Futurama, including every single series finale they ever did. Even though these were written sort of as a 4-episode mini-arc, Bender's Big Score feels really cohesive overall, and most importantly, the character work is excellent. This is something I talk about at length in another video, but the Fry and Leela focused story is truly something special in Bender's Big Score. Leela falls for a guy named Lars in a whirlwind romance, which obviously upsets Fry, but through the time travel shenanigans we eventually learn that Lars is in fact a time paradox duplicate of Fry, who lived out a separate life back in the 2000s. Lars is basically a Fry who has grown and emotionally matured, which is obviously very attractive to Leela. She's said this before.
Fry is very sweet, but he's so immature. I love his boyish charm, but I hate his childishness.
And while watching the film the first time makes you sort of hate Lars because he's interfering with the Fry and Leela romance, on rewatch, knowing who he is, it makes all of these sequences really endearing.
I don't know who I am anymore.
I know who you are. You're the woman I've been waiting for all my life.
My favorite is actually this date montage. It's really lovely and you can feel their romance and connection growing, even though it hurts Fry in the process. But
1 second. I need to go see something real quick. Okay, I'm back. Let's continue.
But the coolest part about the Lars-Leela storyline is that Lars actually propels our version of Fry's growth forward faster than he might have grown otherwise. Lars' experience in the 2000s actually taught him the selflessness he needed. He learned that letting Leela go was actually the best thing for her, and that if he truly cared about her, that her happiness needed to come first.
You too. It's enough to know you're happy with Lars.
This was, of course, before he realized that he himself was the very Lars he was jealous of.
I'm Lars? I'm Lars!
But Lars' romance with Leela actually propels Fry forward in that same exact way, and Fry shows that same selflessness in the face of his own heartbreak. It's a really cool way to tell this story because ultimately we actually spend much more time with Lars in Bender's Big Score than we do with our Fry. But through Lars' journey, we understand and see that important growth in Fry. And at the end of the movie, we get this lovely little button with Fry and Leela.
He was a good man, Leela.
Yeah, you were.
Now, as much as I adore Bender's Big Score, that isn't to say I thought it was perfect. I did think that the nude scammer villains left a little bit to be desired. They had some really funny sequences, but the story itself felt bigger and more grand than its villains. It also brings in the Nibelonians for about 1 minute before they're knocked out of the picture for the remainder of the film.
Our kitten-class attack ships were no match for their mighty chairs.
But it also used other side characters really effectively. The Harlem Globetrotters are hilarious as always, and Robot Santa makes a couple very funny appearances, including a hysterical song with the Hanukkah Zombie and Kwanzaa Bot. And while I did find the subplot with Hermes' severed head to be pretty entertaining, LaBarbara's lack of support for Hermes felt like a stark contrast to the relationship we'd seen from them in the original run, though I do understand that the writers really wanted to include Barbados Slim. And to top everything off, the film ended on a pretty wild cliffhanger, with the time paradox duplicates of Bender creating a massive tear in the universe. Nibbler even eats himself to escape. And this giant tear in the universe would play a massive role in the second straight-to-DVD movie, The Beast with a Billion Backs, which would release on June 24th, 2008, about 7 months after Bender's Big Score.
Crap.
The sky is clear.
At the time, The Beast with a Billion Backs was not nearly as well received as Bender's Big Score. The screenplay was written by Eric Kaplan, and while it did focus on the giant rip in the universe caused in Bender's Big Score, it definitely doesn't feel like a sequel to that film, which personally I think is a good thing. I have to admit, when I saw The Beast with a Billion Backs for the first time, I did not love it, and initially this was my least favorite of all 4 of these Futurama movies. However, the more time I've spent watching these movies, the more this one has grown on me. While I still think much of this story leaves a lot to be desired, I also think that it is a very funny movie. There are some seriously classic Futurama jokes and moments throughout it, including one so legendary that I laugh every single time I think about it.
I knew you'd come back!
Here you go!
But unlike Bender's Big Score, this is where you can really start to see the seams of the story.
Oh my,
A bit more clearly. The transitions between each of the 4 episodes of the movie are a little more clear. They immediately introduce a new love interest for Fry, Colleen, who admittedly is a very funny character, driven by an excellent Brittany Murphy performance. Rest in peace to a legend. This story is basically all about jealousy. Fry enters a polyamorous relationship with Colleen, who is dating and lives with a handful of other men already, and while he thinks he can look past this, he decides he can't handle this kind of relationship. But by the end of the movie, Fry is spearheading the biggest polyamorous relationship in history, as he's basically the spokesperson for the interdimensional being Yivo, who lives on the other side of the giant hole in the universe. Fry basically recruits the remainder of society into the cult of Yivo, who then all attempt to date Schler simultaneously. Eventually, the entire universe decides to move in with Yivo, mirroring Fry's decision with Colleen at the beginning of the film, but since only organic matter can pass through the tear in the universe, Bender and all the other robots are left behind, which basically leads to Bender's jealousy story that his friend Fry has left him for someone new. There's also a subplot where Amy sleeps with Zap after Kif is killed in an assault on Yivo, which leads to further jealousy from Kif after he's revived. Even the Professor and Wernstrom's rivalry contains a ton of professional jealousy as they fight over who can or should solve the issues at hand. So yeah, thematically, this film is all about jealousy and relationships, which I can definitely appreciate in broad strokes. They did a good job making sure that every subplot of the story had ties to this overall theme, and I think that really helps the movie overall. However, while the themes all tie, the plot still feels a bit disjointed, at least compared to the previous film. The second episode in particular feels very disconnected from everything else, introducing the League of Robots into Bender's story, but sort of moving away from the Colleen stuff, and relegating the giant tear in the universe to the background for a bit. In fact, it almost felt to me like the League of Robots could have or should have been its own episode of Futurama, like maybe it was an idea they had in the original run that they shoehorned into this movie, though I can't say that for sure. But in the end, I still have a lot of fondness for The Beast with a Billion Backs. It's incredibly funny, has some great performances, and does some really interesting work with its theming across all of its subplots. Plus, it has one final voiceover performance from Brittany Murphy, and she's really great in the role.
I've got good wine, 5 sweethearts, and today I was promoted to Chief of Police.
There are also some really awesomely conceived and directed sequences, animation-wise. The Nimbus flying around and attacking the tentacles is really cool. I always love this duel scene between Bender and Calculon. It's super creative, and I low-key love the sequence where everyone starts to leave the universe to head to Yivo, like a mass ascension to heaven. Really great stuff. Interestingly, though, they chose not to leave off any sort of cliffhanger that sets up the following film, Bender's Game, like they did between the first 2 films, which personally I didn't love. I think they should have either gone all in on connecting the 4 movies, or not at all, though I don't really have any pitch on how they could have connected the second and third movies, but they should have done it. And speaking of, let's talk about the third film, Bender's Game, which released on November 4th, 2008. This film was written a bit differently than the others, as it has 5 credited writers who all tackled different episodes of the story. Parts 1 and 2 were written by Eric Horsted, Part 3 was written by Michael Rowe and Eric Kaplan, and Part 4 was penned by David X. Cohen and Patrick Verone, though it is worth noting that the story credit goes to both Eric Horsted and David X. Cohen. But I think these writing credits are pretty important for Bender's Game because this is the Futurama movie that absolutely does not feel like a movie. So these different writers tackling all the different parts of the story makes a lot of sense after watching it. Parts 1 and 2 of Bender's Game feel sort of related, but very much operate as separate episodes. Parts 3 and 4 definitely feel more connected to each other, but completely disconnected from the first 2 parts. The main through line of this story is Bender's overactive imagination causing him to roleplay as a fantasy character named Titanius Anglesmith. Part 1 details his descent into madness and complete detachment from reality, which admittedly can be very funny at times. Part 2 completes that descent to madness by showing Bender institutionalized in the same robot insane asylum we saw back in the original run in the episode Insane in the Mainframe. I also have to admit that I really like a lot of this stuff. Insane in the Mainframe is a great episode, and seeing a lot of these characters again was really fun.
I was designed by a team of engineers attempting to build an insane robot. But it seems they failed!
But running simultaneous to this Bender stuff are some tough-to-follow stories about Mom, Farnsworth, and the existence of dark matter as fuel in the universe, plus some weird Leela anger stuff complete with shock therapy. They attempt to tie all of these stories together for parts 3 and 4, but I honestly still don't even fully understand how it works. They basically use this dark matter sci-fi story to facilitate the creation of this fantasy world through Bender's imagination. So, parts 3 and 4 of Bender's game are a full-on fantasy world parody. But personally, these last two parts don't work for me at all. They really feel like nothing more than a parody of better fantasy stories, whereas Futurama was always best making its sci-fi premises feel unique to its own world building, even if they were inspired by other sci-fi material. It's especially noticeable after watching 3 seasons of Disenchantment, which does a significantly better job building out its own world and lore in a fantasy setting, rather than feeling like a comedy knockoff of existing worlds. It is always jarring to me when this movie switches between the sci-fi world and the fantasy world. I appreciate that they tried to tie the stories together and explain it through the sci-fi, but it never quite works for me. I think the first 2 parts of Bender's game have enough going on comedically to keep me pretty engaged, but I just simply am not a fan of the fantasy episodes. More than any of these 4 movies, this one feels like a series of loosely connected episodes instead of one cohesive story. I also have to say that I have a ton of frustrations about a certain reveal in this episode. We learn that Mom's son Ignor is actually Professor Farnsworth's son as well, which I think makes a ton of sense given the context of the series, but they absolutely never bring the storyline up again in the remainder of the show, which seems like a major missed opportunity. They also reintroduce Nibbler in the episode without ever explaining how he returned after eating himself at the end of Bender's Big Score, and they also very clumsily explain why they're not surprised he can talk.
Hey, wait, aren't you amazed I can speak?
Well, actually, no. You forgot to blank our memories after you spoke last time.
Okay, but if Nibbler had been wiping your memories, then how did you know he ever wiped your memory? This is a dumb piece of dialogue and only makes sense to the audience and wouldn't make sense to the characters. So yeah, overall, I'm not a huge fan of Bender's game. I think some of it works and is funny, but the success of the episodes rests on the fantasy parody, which I think doesn't work particularly well. It does have interesting ramifications for the Futurama world at large. The result of this film is that dark matter no longer functions as a fuel source, so the remainder of the series, the ships use whale oil instead, which is pretty funny. Also, I laugh at this line every single time.
Huh. So that's why they call me the Catman.
And that brings us to the final Futurama film, Into the Wild Green Yonder, once again written by Ken Keeler. This
That's now 55.
This is a really interesting one because it was written as though it could have been a series finale, something that they had to do 4 times over the course of Futurama. And while I do think this movie does a lot of great work in the finale department, as a story, it feels a bit overstuffed. They go to great lengths to make this one have a larger scale, but personally it still doesn't feel as grand as Bender's Big Score, which is a bit of a bummer. This movie also ties a few long-standing threads from Futurama's original run into the story, finally revealing who this dude with the number 9 shirt is, a background character who they allegedly had plans for throughout the entire series, as well as bringing us the finale of the Free Waterfall saga. If you didn't know, the Waterfall family is a family of activists first introduced in The Problem with Poplars. Every time a member of the family is featured in an episode, they die at the end, sort of a weird little underlying story arc. The movie does start with an incredible opening sequence with a song sung by Seth MacFarlane, and I have to say, this song gets stuck in my head regularly. I really appreciated the entire intro, and it's cool that Seth came in to sing this song for him.
You and I will be reborn in a future place and time.
But again, the movie really does feel overstuffed. The first story is all about Fry getting in an accident that gives him mind-reading abilities while Bender has an affair with the Donbot's wife. The two of them both enter a poker tournament, which, saying all of it out loud, makes it feel really disconnected from the overall plot. The real through line of the film are Fry's mind-reading and introduction to the Legion of Madfellows, and Leela joining the eco-feminist collective that protests across the solar system. And I think what works best about this movie overall is how it ties Fry and Leela's stories together. As it turns out, Fry's mission from the Legion of Madfellows and Leela's mission in her eco-feminist collective are one and the same, to save the Violet Dwarf Star from being destroyed. However, because of an ancient evil known as the Dark One, which can read thoughts, nobody except for Fry can have a plan to stop the Dark One from destroying the star, since his lack of a Delta brainwave makes it impossible for his thoughts to be read, so the plan can't be learned by the Dark One. Every time I explain this plot point in a video, it sounds so convoluted, I'm kind of tired of talking about it, but I do think it works well with Fry and Leela's story. Early on in the movie, Leela and some protesters are accidentally responsible for the death of Vice President Agnew, and so she goes on the run from the law. She tries to explain herself to Fry, but Fry doesn't actually need her to explain.
You're you. That's all I need to know.
This is a really sweet moment that shows how much Fry believes in Leela and how much he knows and understands her as a person. But at the end of the movie, Leela is struggling to afford Fry the same belief, as it appears as though Fry is working to destroy the Violet Dwarf Star and cannot tell her his true plan because of the Dark One.
First of all, I'm positive of copyright. And second of all, Into the Wild Green Yonder, I gotta say, it's one of the worst Futurama movies. Even though it's one of the finales, it's just one of the worst ones out there. Like, the best one was, for me, is Bender's Big Score, and that was just mediocre. This is why I don't like the movie era of Futurama.
Fortunately, Leela eventually comes to her senses.
You're you. That's all I need to know.
I truly love these moments in the story and think that it's a really nice way to put Fry and Leela's relationship and bond at the forefront.
I love these moments in the story and think that it's a really nice way to put Fry and Leela's relationship. I truly love these moments in the story and think that it's a really nice way to put Fry and Leela's relationship and bond at the forefront of the story, even in a movie where they're separated nearly the entire time. This final sequence also features pretty much every single character that has ever been in Futurama, which is nice for a send-off, and they even wrap up the waterfall story in a pretty massive way, which is fun for longtime fans of the show. And while it does feel a little tacked on, when the crew eventually escapes and is chased down by Zapp Brannigan, it leads to some really nice finale moments before what could have been the end of the series. Fry and Leela kiss, and the crew pushes forward into a wormhole, not knowing what their fate will be.
Into the breach, meatbags. Or not. Yeah, whatever. Go, go, go!
I've always liked this final little stretch and think it would have been a solid ending had the show never returned, which of course it did. So yeah, there's a lot to like in Into the Wild Green Yonder, but I definitely think it's much less cohesive as a movie than the others, especially thematically, except for Bender's Game, of course. It feels like they could have done more to tie Fry and Leela's stuff into the story sooner, and some of the plot points in Leela's activist story start to feel really spread thin. They get caught, tried, arrested, sent to prison, and broken out all in a matter of like 10 minutes. I think one of the biggest problems this movie is that it has this underlying theme of women being disrespected and treated unfairly by men and by society, while the script itself sort of also disrespects the female characters. It ends up reading like the writers and script are covering their protesting talking points in a sarcastic tone. Sometimes it feels like they're making commentary, but other times it feels like they're just reinforcing these same issues. But overall, Into the Wild Green Yonder does a lot of stuff right and sends Futurama off in a pretty satisfying way. So let's talk about this era of Futurama overall. Was it a success or was it a failure? Where does it stand in the history of the series? Well, personally, I think it was a mostly successful endeavor, even if they had some stumbles and missteps along the way. I'll forever appreciate that these movies exist and tried to tell Futurama stories in a new way. It was a fun experiment, and I think that if they had more time, they might have been able to perfect this style of storytelling for Futurama. Bender's Big Score will forever stand as one of my favorite Futurama stories, and while I don't love Bender's Game, there is plenty that I enjoy and appreciate about The Beast with a Billion Backs and Into the Wild Green Yonder. I think if I could change anything about this movie season, it would have been to somehow shift these stories so that Bender's Big Score was the final film. That's the movie that felt the biggest and had the biggest ramifications for the character stories that we have been following for years in the original run. While I enjoy the Fry and Leela stuff that worked in Into the Wild Green Yonder, I don't think it worked as well as it did in Bender's Big Score. Plus, the time travel aspect of BBS actually works really well for a final film, feeding the audience some pretty great fan service with all of the connections to Fry's past and older episodes. It would have felt like these stories had been escalating to the biggest and most character-focused story, but that would have required a lot of rewrites and reworking, and overall, I'm still happy with how it went down, mostly. I think this era of Futurama actually probably goes underappreciated. They delivered some really fun stuff in a brand new format, something that is not easy to do. And while I'm glad that the series eventually came back and graced us with traditional TV episodes again, I'll always appreciate the risks that were taken and ambitious stories that were told in this weird little movie season. But how do y'all feel about the Futurama straight-to-DVD movies? Do you think they worked? Are they among some of your favorite Futurama episodes or least favorite? Let me know below in the comments. Also, make sure to check out my podcast, Cartoons That Curse. I mentioned this earlier.